We are recording. All right, welcome to the SIG Auth meeting for January 10th, 2018. Go ahead and jump into the agenda. We didn't have any announcements or demos listed. So we'll jump right down to pull requests people wanted to call out. So there weren't names beside these, but I'm gonna guess Mike wanted to mention the token request one. Mike is muted.
I've got a question related to that one, actually. I didn't read through the initial proposal, but it wasn't obvious to me whether we were going to put a status on that object as well, like a condition that would indicate check back later something is going to write this, as opposed to immediately responding with a token every time.
So one of the main goals of the proposal was to stop exposing tokens via the API, so that if it became asynchronous, then anything that could read back the token. So the goal was to not make it something that other things could observe.
Okay, so does that mean that the API object isn't quite what we had initially wanted, or does that mean the intent is that this is never going to be persisted? The poll as currently written has a token request status that includes the token.
I guess I don't understand the question. It is a non-storage backed API.
Yeah, it's the request response spec status, however we want to think about it, imperative, non-persisted style.
Okay, and the intent is for it to always be that. Okay.
Yes.
So if you haven't looked at the accompanying proposal yet, I'd encourage you to look at that as well. This is part of our ongoing effort to improve point of use and point of use generation of tokens and reduce their visibility to arbitrary people via the API, along with things like scoping to audience and scoping and time bounding, things like that. Was there anything you wanted to call out on that, Mike, or just for people's attention?
No, I think I have some things that I want to talk about the design. I don't know, is this the right time to talk about it, or should we wait until later on?
How about if we get through everything and then we'll circle back and discuss stuff?
That sounds good to me.
Okay. The KMS provider, SIG architecture, talked through this, and it sounded like the GRPC approach was reasonable. That got documented in the proposal, and that has been moved into an actual pull request. So work is proceeding on that to enable delegating to encrypt via a GRPC hook from the API server.
I also, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I also wanted to just mention that so we took out the TLS kind of authorization and authentication piece of it, so it's just a local Unix domain socket now, which I think is the right thing for the initial piece. We're kind of discussing internally how we want to run this, and we're kind of considering maybe running it off the master. So I think after that PR is in, and with the basic kind of local domain socket, we may want to have another PR where we discuss either a TLS or authenticated GRPC somehow. But I'd like to kind of like separate those two things, because I think this is a nice package to get in kind of as is.
Okay. I actually had a question for you about it, right? The Google Doc, you were active in the Google Doc, and then it looked like activity had died down. Had we reached agreement in the Google Doc initially? Are we prepared to say that in principle we agree with the poll for the community as it is today?
So I think from our perspective, we're happy with it. I think, yeah, the discussion died down in the Google Doc pretty quickly. I think the major remaining question was like, are we okay with the GRPC interface? And I think that's now solved. So yeah, as far as I know, we're mostly in agreement. We could do like detailed review of actual code.
Okay.
Yeah. The only question I had was around the version parameter. That was kind of not cargo culted, but modeled after the way the kubelet gRPC interfaces were set up. And right. I don't have a lot of experience with versioning gRPC interfaces, so I wanted to make sure someone who did kind of had a clear picture in their head of how that would be used going forward.
Okay. Do you want that before we approve the proposal?
I don't feel strongly that.
Okay. I think I'd like to say then that by the end of this week, I plan to merge the community poll for the design. So if you want more comments, go ahead and review again. It's been open in the Google Doc for a while. It's been linked and discussed here multiple times.
Yep.
So I'm not expecting to see any.
Okay.
Thanks, David. This is KK. Thanks for merging that 1581 pull request for the doc.
Yep.
All right. Eric, do you want to call out your external auth provider?
Yeah, so this went through another iteration over the break. I've had some time to update it based off of feedback. This is a proposal to add an exec-based plugin to Client Go and kubectl, so you could use sort of alternative credential rotation strategies or fetching strategies. There are some open concerns about how to do things like request signing if we ever potentially want to do that, or respond to events like Client Go receiving a 401 indicating that the credentials are likely expired or invalid. So I know there was a ton of interest in sort of this getting in for 110. So if people who are sort of interested in it and concerned, it'd be really great to hear some feedback on those open questions. And they're right there at the end of the proposal if you want to scroll down. Basically, we're running out of, because we use standard in for the login potentially, and we let the config specify arguments and environment variables, we're running out of ways to feed in information into the plugin itself. So we may want to drop something or add additional hooks or whatever.
Are these blocking issues or something that we could discuss concurrently with other work?
If you don't have an open channel to be able to get information to the command when you first start, you're not likely to be able to shim one in easily.
Yeah, making sure that we don't paint ourselves into a corner where we cut off the ability to do things like interactive login, have a way to present information to the user, but then also return the credentials to kube control. It's basically the API between kube control and the plugin that we're trying to nail down. Okay. I'm not sure who added this to the needs review list. Was this server bootstrapping or client bootstrapping?
Oh, apologies. I think I added that and then I added it again later with my name. This is both. Just so from SIG cluster lifecycle, we're interested in getting kubelet. We're using kubeADM uses kubelet TLS bootstrapping. This is not rotation. This is like the initial bootstrap where kubelet gets a bootstrap kube config, goes in and bootstraps TLS certificates, client certificates for itself. Well, I guess the bootstrap is both, right? So we're interested in both. I guess I just wanted to get general feedback about what kind of blockers there are to get that to GA and whether that might happen in 110.
So Mike, I know that you had kind of been thinking how we wanted to be able to evolve this, both for like kind of having long-lived Bootstrap credentials that we could return to as a base credential, so that we always had something we could go back to get a client, and then combining that with cloud provider specific attestation types of capabilities. So I think when we talked, you had said that some of that was leading you to.
The returning to a Bootstrap credential is an attribute of the client rotation, which I think is potentially separate from this specific feature. And then the deployment specific attestation, I think we can knock out inside the authentication provider plugin stuff. So actually, I feel pretty good with this specific portion of kubelet client certificate rotation or client certificate bootstrapping. I don't actually have any changes to it that I can think of off the top of my head.
Mike, just to clarify, so you're talking about basically if you have some provider-specific attestation mechanism, sort of rolling that into an authentication provider and not using the Bootstrap certificate mechanism, like sort of just using your attestation as authentication directly?
No.
Okay.
So for the Bootstrap, how client TLS Bootstrap works in kubelet today is you hand it a kubeconfig. So I would like to be able to have that initial authentication, and I think you're authenticating as a user who is in the group node Bootstrap or something. I would like to have that initial authentication be able to take advantage of like TPM or VM signed identity document. I think we can, if we extend kubeconfig and client Go to support passing this sort of authentication context, then we can get deployment specific attributes in that initial authentication. Does that make sense?
So the client Go auth provider work would work with any kubeconfig consumer, not just kubectl. So in your Bootstrap config, rather than a static token, you could say, here's how I can call out on GCE or AWS to do some stuff that embeds like a TPM attestation or something.
So, yeah, and you could potentially do something expensive.
Yeah.
I wrote up some. I wrote up a little bit of this for the issue tracker in the thing link there. My main concern is sort of for systems where we want to do something like an Acme challenge. Then I don't know how those call and response type things, if client Go auth providers would be sufficient for that. Sort of an alternative design decision that I know that I heard Liggett talking about, at least, was just having the kubelet reload credentials as it comes in, and having some external system do all the CSRs is also an alternative mechanism.
I mean, I think the key is that the interface externally doesn't change, like in the Bootstrap case, where you say, here's the kubeconfig that you use to Bootstrap, and right now it only has a certain set of capabilities. But as we add more capabilities to client Go loading things from kubeconfig, it would be good to keep these use cases in mind, so we don't put it into just kubecontrol, we put it into the actual client Go library. So that would enable pretty advanced use cases inside the kubelet or inside other components. So from the client Bootstrap case, externally the shape seems reasonable, just for the Bootstrap case. For the rotation case, that's where I get a little fuzzier about like picking up stuff externally, versus baking all the rotation stuff into the kubelet.
Right. Yeah, and I have some open questions about how client rotation is currently implemented, or certificate rotation in general, inside the certificate manager. But I don't think that needs to block Bootstrap or Kubelet Bootstrap or Kubelet client certificate Bootstrap. Does anybody have an alternative opinion on that?
So I think one of the issues you're referring to is like certificates expiring, and then what happens? Like if your cluster gets suspended for a little while or something, and then all the certs expire if they're only valid for, let's say, a short time. How do we kind of reissue certs and get back to a working cluster? So you're saying like that kind of issue is separable from the Bootstrap?
Yeah, the Bootstrap flow seems pretty solid, and I think it's separate from the rotation because, and it also has been implemented for a lot longer.
So it's only been in Kubelet for 2 releases now, but it was basically the same code in KubeADM before that for several releases, right?
In fact, I think the code in Kubelet is like almost 2 years old. So Kubelet has had that functionality for a lot longer than kubeadmin has been using it.
Okay, I think that answered my question. It sounds like there's no immediate blockers, so I might write up a features issue about just sort of letting at least the bootstrap kube command, bootstrap kube config flag for kubelet graduate to GA, even if sort of rotation and stuff is not GA.
That sounds. I am not opposed to that.
Yeah. For the serving cert bootstrapping, there are 2 things it's blocked on. One is the trustworthiness of node addresses that are self-reported. And the other is just the mechanics of the way the kubelet starts up. Like it expects to have a cert before it sets up its server listeners, and then it expects that cert to never change, or to, well, the things that drive changing that cert are not like the addresses changing. So that needs refactoring, and that work just hasn't progressed. So it can't go to GA until that work is done, and I don't see that work progressing.
Well, it can't go to beta. I think it's alpha right now.
Yeah, right. Like we can't enable it by default until those are resolved.
And just to sort of provide some background for why we opened that issue, as CoreOS goes forward, we'd like to utilize more of the CSR bootstrapping, but are sort of unclear about how much of it is going to happen in the kubelet or happen externally. So I think to an extent, it would be easier for us in some cases to have an external agent doing some of this, and that impacts the design decisions of us using the kubelet flags versus writing an agent that handles all of this ourselves.
I think the right answer there depends a lot on the complexity of your certificate flows.
Yeah, definitely. I wasn't saying that it was going to be the one size fits all. It just is sort of why we were having these questions lately.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to see people start pushing on these because they have been neglected, I think.
I guess just to add context to my context for bringing this from SIG cluster lifecycle is just an overall push to get features out of beta that KubeADM depends on. KubeADM is in use in a lot of places, and really we should be able to start calling it GA at some point. So we're trying to sort of audit all the things we're depending on, making sure that everything's marching towards GA at least.
Yeah, the node address trustworthiness intersects with some of the work that I'm wanting to work on in 110. So I'm interested in other pieces like labeling and taints, but address trustworthiness is at least on my radar, to advance in 110. So that's API enabling work 10. All right. Yeah, if you have thoughts, chime in on the issues and features that are linked there. Greg, you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, so we've been kicking around an idea a little bit internally about running a Kubernetes bug bounty or vulnerability reward program. So I think probably most people on this call are familiar with what bug bounties are. And to some extent, Kubernetes is covered by Google's bug bounty in that, GKE is in scope. But we've been kind of discussing whether we could set up a bug bounty just for the open source project and kind of what that would take, kind of what level of investment it would take, and how we could organize it. And so I just wanted to kind of raise that idea here to kind of gauge people's interest, and I can kind of give a brief outline of how I think it could work. And so we're kind of imagine that we'd probably engage like a third party, like a bug crowd or a HackerOne or something like that would do some sort of initial triage. And then, so that's kind of like to not get us completely overwhelmed by kind of low quality reports. And the idea is that they have enough expertise to kind of do a first level triage, and that we'd only get confirmed vulnerabilities coming through to us. And then we'd have possibly reusing the security Kubernetes security list, or maybe setting up something different. We'd have some sort of rotation for people who'd like do like the second level triage, log into the vendor web UI, and look at the bug and start working on fixes or start organizing fixes. In terms of like money, Google would be ponying up money, and we could potentially,
I think that's still for discussion, whether we do a joint payout between us and other providers, or whether Google all of it. But that's one option for us to pursue.
Yeah. So Google will certainly contribute. It might be a bucket of money. It might be, but we can. That's kind of like pending finance people figuring that out. I don't think that's really super interesting for this meeting. I'd expect kind of like we'd have a spike. If we did this, we'd kind of have a spike fairly immediately after the announcement as people kind of look for a low-hanging fruit. And so ideally, we'd kind of want, if we sort of bought into this as a community, I think we'd want to have a bunch of kind of SIG Auth people from different companies that had some time blocked out. So we were kind of prepared to deal with a bit of a spike and dedicate some resources to it. And I think we'd also probably want to give a heads up across like the whole community that this was coming, because we might be asking other SIGs for work a bit more urgently than normal as well too. And I think
I'll just add on to that, Greg. I think there would be a spike obviously at an initial announcement, but there would be a spike at every release you could imagine. Every time a new set of features come out, you'd have a spike. And there also still very much under discussion, but if we wanted to provide some sort of SLA as to how quickly we'd respond to certain types of vulnerabilities, which you could expect from larger projects, that might be something to take into consideration as well. If we get a P0 vulnerability, are we willing to drop everything to address that?
Yeah, and I think in terms of sort of work for us, I think it would be like, I think the most ideal vulnerability kind of programs are ones where the security researcher has like a really nice on-ramp. Like there's kind of a well-defined scope, like what's in, what's out. And I think because Kubernetes is also like a big project that you can configure so many different ways, that we'd probably almost have to go to the extent of like an example application that like has some security guarantees about this namespace shouldn't be able to interact with that namespace. These RBAC rules enforce this distinction between these two parts of the application. Maybe something like that would give like explicit things that security researchers could like have a quick thing to run up and start testing.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment too, is I think the Kubernetes security model is still a little too fuzzy for us to be able to make black and white distinctions between valid and invalid bugs.
Well, I mean, if you are configuring all the controls we have in place, so you have a namespace constrained user that has the admin role, that has a network policy in place and a pod security policy that can do X, Y, and Z. Given those constraints, can you do bad things? Like, I agree with Greg. Like, if it's really well defined, then I think it could be really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. If we really explicitly document, this is the environment, this is the system under test basically, and these are the rules, that could work.
Yeah, I think that documentation needs to be like code and configuration too, not like words. So like it would be like, I'd imagine like maybe use kubeadm or you have like a defined way to stand up the cluster, and then you have a defined application with exactly like those kind of guarantees that you would explicitly test. Yeah.
Yeah, and you probably want to think about for optional components like network policy, whether you want to make those in or out of scope, because you'd be fundamentally depending on something that isn't actually in Kubernetes in terms of the rendering of that policy.
Yeah.
My proposal would be to start small and see that it works and see that we can actually define something small and go from there. Pick a very, very small scenario. That's already going to be a lot of work to define. And then the also look at the other thing we have to figure out is whether the standard bug bounty triage scales work for our use case. So the standard providers out there all have a scale of what they define as a P0, P1, et cetera. Those are usually based on web apps, not so much infrastructure. So figuring out if we need to build our own scale, again, could take some work to finalize or not. And then as Greg already mentioned, the ongoing commitment would be updating this on a regular basis as part of releases and committing to actually fixing the things that people find.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what we're proposing here is a whole ton of work. But I think there's some real tangible benefits to like having, essentially having some money where our mouth is in terms of some of the security controls that we've put in place. I think is very reassuring and a good thing for the ecosystem. And I think it's also, I mean, I guess I'm making just a general case for bug bounties here, but I mean, Google's definitely seen like very high value from its bug bounty, but it has been also significant work. Yeah.
So I'm going to throw out another idea as a sort of a way to frame the bug bounty as through cluster conformance. If we could create a conformance suite that require, maybe this is not the standard conformance suite, but another level of security conformance that checks that you have all these security features enabled, and then say bugs are valid if you can reproduce them in a conformant cluster. I mean, we don't have that sort of suite right now.
Yeah, that's along the lines of what I was thinking too.
Yeah, this would be an alternative to something like kubeadmin. Like kubeadmin could by default produce a cluster that actually meets all this par, but it also means that other clusters that aren't kubeadmin clusters could also be conformated in the security sense.
So I guess the question coming from me and Greg is, should we spend some time kind of fleshing out what this could look like in a bit more detail and share that back with the group?
Yeah, I think there's definitely value there because the impact is cross SIG. I'm trying to figure out the best kind of venue for discussing this, making sure it has the right visibility. Like if we all say, yeah, this sounds great, and then it goes and happens, and then suddenly like 8 other SIGs have 10 things they have to go fix urgently. It'd be nice if they knew it was coming or weighed in on how it rolled out.
There's a related amount of work that Maya, you mentioned, is like sort of tracking SLAs and actually just tracking open security issues. There's not sort of that's sort of delegated to all the SIGs right now, and I think it falls apart a little bit.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned that is internally at Google we have some standards for how we deal with certain levels of priority bugs, but there's also standards for the Project Zero. So if Project Zero finds, for example, a P0 vulnerability in another vendor system, depending on responsible disclosure agreements they have and stuff like that, sometimes they force I say force. They strongly suggest that the vendor disclose that within a week. So for example, if there was a P0 vulnerability in Kubernetes that had been discovered by Project Zero, we would be subject to the same constraints. So figuring out how to best respond to some of these vulnerabilities in general should be something we figure out. Right now with the set of people that's emailed on that security list, that makes sense. But if we hit something really, really big, how do we get out that message sooner? How do we push a fix much sooner than that? We're going to have to figure that out anyways.
This also seems like something that CNCF would reasonably fund, and also it seems like something that would be useful for other CNCF projects. So it might be worth looping in organizers over there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think our next step is to kind of like write down kind of what this might look like, and share that back. And yeah, I take the point of like it needs to be like a much bigger than just SIG Auth kind of discussion and decision, because yeah, I would hate to basically SIG Auth ends up delegating a whole lot of work to other SIGs that they weren't expecting.
What are you talking about? People love it when we do that.
And yeah, that all happening with compressed time frames, etc. So yeah, we'll do that. We'll write this up a bit more, and we'll share fairly broadly and see what the reaction is.
Okay. All right. Moving on to the next item. This was a poll that I had opened. There's kind of a long-standing issue around RBAC specifically. One of the things that RBAC does is prevents you from creating or updating RBAC objects that go beyond the permissions you have. So if you're not allowed to create deployments, then you can't create a role that includes the create deployments permission. If you can't create deployments, then you can't bind a role that has the create deployments permission. And so as long as you are living fully within the RBAC universe, that does a really good job of keeping people from escalating their permissions. But where it gets a little weird is if you are using two authorizers. And so GKE has hit this where if you're a super user from GKE's perspective and you try to go create an RBAC role, RBAC says, well, you don't have this permission inside this role, so no, you can't do that. So I had taken a stab at fixing this by changing the escalation check rather than checking just RBAC permissions to actually ask the current authorizer, can this user, does this user have super user permissions? And I know CJ had some concerns about that, and just trying to figure out the best way to kind of let RBAC escalation checks honor things that other authorizers use. So I don't know if CJ is on the.
Yep, I'm here.
Call. All right,
yeah, so I didn't mean to like shut this down completely. I think it's a reasonable workaround to ask authorizers whether the calling user is a super user. Our authorizer is not set up to handle that question currently. There's probably some hackery we could do to figure out how to answer the *** question.
And to be clear, that what this looked like was a subject access review that said, can this user do everything? Yeah.
Yeah, so my thought was that if there was some way to get into the covers check and have that integrate with your authorizer chain, that would be better. But we would still have the problem of having to answer a star verb or a star resource, because RBAC rules that you create can have stars in them. And I personally think it's weird for the subject access review contract to allow asking questions about star. That might just be my Google IAM bias. So I wanted to open that up to like what other authorization systems would do in that case.
So either the authorization system recognizes star as a special thing, or it doesn't. If it recognizes it as a special thing that means anything, then great, we're on the same page. If it doesn't recognize it as a special thing, which means anything, then that would mean that it would only answer true if they had explicitly been granted like a literal star permission, or they were a super user, right?
Right. So for example, in our IAM system, there's no such thing as a star permission. There are ways to construct roles where you can use sort of star-like language that include all, statically defined permissions into a role. But the asking about a star resource or a star permission just isn't a thing.
Okay. So I don't think enumeration of every possible verb and resource is an option at this point. Like, people can define arbitrary new resources, right? And they can ask arbitrary new verbs. Like, you can ask a subject access review, can you educate a dolphin, to go back to my favorite example. And so assuming that we can enumerate everything without using star, I don't think is possible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a philosophical thing. It also comes down to RBAC having a different concept of escalation than, for example, Google's IAM. The fact that I have the ability to create pods in Google's IAM does not imply that I can give you the ability to create pods in the same places. The only thing that controls that is whether I can set policy on that resource.
So would it make more sense? So for binding roles, we actually had this issue originally, and we let you bind a role if you have all the permissions in the role, or if you have the bind verb on the role. Would it make sense to go that route instead and have, I don't even know what you would call it, escalate?
Like bind escalate?
Well, you're not binding, but an explicit
Create
check
escalate.
to say, like, you're allowed to set up permissions that you don't have in a role. I don't know what we would call it, but it would be a particular check instead of a covers check, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that would solve our problem, I think. That would make this transition for Google's IAM into RBAC work. Now, I don't know, philosophically it felt nice that if we were able to somehow bridge the gap by saying we're doing an escalation, we're doing a covers check, but we're doing it with all your authorizers. That felt nicer, but digging into it, I don't know if it's actually possible.
It's really non-performant. Like, a covers check can
possible.
be like,
It's very expensive.
yeah, it'd be like 100, 200 individual queries.
I mean, you're also trying to say, what are the objects that exist at this time? I'm going to ask about all of them, but now I allowed you to create a role that could apply to some objects that don't exist yet.
So one problem that I have with reusing the subject access review or something like this is that you're really playing double duty. What you really want is a new type of call, which is like subject access summary or something like that, which essentially is asking the authorization system to provide a summary in terms of, like, a translation from one type of description to another type of description. Sometimes it's going to be possible, sometimes it's not. I think it's also interesting to look at, like, as, Istio's taking a dependency on the OPA stuff. They've submitted their stuff to the CNCF. We should think about that in terms also. It's not clear that this generalization will work for things beyond GKE. So it's a bigger space than just GKE here.
Right, yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up. I don't want this to be a let's fix GKE poll.
And I don't think it was. I think it was attempting to use the existing interface that we have for asking the authorizer questions. And even within that, there are two ways we can do it. One is trying to model asking about a super user permission, and the other is trying to ask a specific question, like, is the authorizer okay with letting you escalate RBAC roles?
So the latter fits nicer into our model of thinking about permissions.
And if your authorizer says you're a super user, well, then it'll say yes to that as well. So I think one falls under the other. All right, let me think about how I would ask that question and maybe see what this looks like with that instead. All right, Mike, you get to close out the meeting.
Yeah, so I wanted to address over VC some of the, actually one topic that was raised in the proposal for token request. The current service account tokens are non-expiring, but they are bound to the lifetime of certain objects. Actually, they are only bound to the lifetime of service accounts. So while they do not expire, if you delete a service account, the ID tokens that was issued for that service account are no longer valid, and we implement that by embedding the GUID of the service account into the ID token, and we check that whenever in the token authorizer.
And the secret. So it's both the service account and the secret.
So I think that is a valuable functionality. The question is, how do we support non-expiring tokens with the new authorizer? So I think Clayton and Liggett think that it would be useful to be able to support non-expiring tokens. And if we supported both of these functionalities, we could have a drop-in replacement for the ID tokens that we currently put into pods as the default service account secret. I don't know how that plays with key rotation for the service account signing keys. So if our objective here is to improve service account signing keys, I think we want to make it possible to implement rotation for those keys. It seems disingenuous to me to issue non-expiring ID tokens for keys that we know that we're going to rotate.
So mostly I wanted to make sure that if someone doesn't want to take on rotating their keys, that they can continue using the system the way it is today, which is tokens remain valid until keys are rotated. I think it's valuable to surface information about what tokens, how many tokens that a key signed are still in use. So you can do that either by putting a expiration time on them. So you say they have a max lifetime of whatever, 30 minutes. And so once I rotate my signing keys, 30 minutes later, I'm good to pull the old key out of rotation as a valid signing key. So the time limit is one way to do it. The other way is to bind these tokens to things that you can query. So today they're bound to service accounts and secret objects. If one of the things that goes in the secret object is the ID of the key that signed it, then you can look and see how many non-expiring but bound to secret object keys or tokens are there that were signed by this, and you can see are they still in use, and then you can track them. I think tokens have to either be expiring or revocable, and so we can make them revocable by binding them to objects that can be deleted.
Even if they were expiring, you would have to keep a relatively short timeline if you weren't going to allow them to be revocable.
Yeah, I think we want them to be revocable by deleting the service account. So I want to maintain the functionality where if you delete a service account, we do that UID check.
Individually revocable, perhaps. The way if you delete the secret today, it revokes that particular token.
Yeah.
Then I'm not sure how to implement that well.
So if you are trying to figure out if it's safe to remove an old signing key, if you have the information about whether there are tokens that it signed that are still active, that will tell you whether it's safe to remove it or not. If it's not safe to remove it because you still have active tokens, then you have to not have those active tokens anymore. And then you're into sort of application domain rotation problems where you say, well, I've got these 100 tokens and they're used by these pods. And you're kind of back to the questions that we've asked. How do we know if it's safe to rotate these pods? Can we set up a new token and then like redeploy? Can we restart the pod? What can we do to give this pod a new token? And if it's a legacy pod that doesn't know how to pick up new tokens and is expecting it to be valid forever, that's going to be really tough. But at least you have the information you need to know what's blocking me from rotating this. Oh, it's these tokens used by these pods.
So I would like to bound the complexity of that. And it seems like that if we do allow non-expiring ID tokens, people are going to hold on to them forever, and people are going to be much less likely to implement rotation in their cluster or turn it on, which I don't think that's desirable.
Another option we have is that as we build this feature out and we gain the ability to automatically rotate, in newer versions, rotation starts to come on, and if your cluster is running things that depend on eternal tokens never expiring, you can turn off that feature, but defaults matter. And if the feature becomes available and usable and client Go gets updated to pick up new tokens, and the thing is sort of using the in-cluster config and client Go clients that we set up would take advantage of token rotation, then new things can no longer count on the defaults giving them eternal tokens. And so I think that's probably how we move the ecosystem towards expecting rotation.
Yeah, so what does that mean for the API? I guess my specific concern is I don't really want to allow a client to request a non-expiring token from this API forever. I think it's valuable as like an intermediate. I think it's a valuable feature for the next 6 months, but how do we remove functionality like this in 6 months or a year, however long it takes to move clients over to a client Go that supports rotation?
Does that seem like the kind of thing that would be a cluster admin decision? Like, what's the longest token you can request? And they get to decide, do I want to continue allowing eternal tokens, or do I want to bound it at a day or something like that?
A super gross solution that might work. This is a proposal here. It's adding a new signing key for the new style of expiring tokens, leaving the existing signing key sort of as is, but then with the plan and the option to disable that legacy signing mechanism.
Yeah, I had also entertained similar ideas. It does seem like a cluster administrative decision I want to, I guess, how do we provide like a reasonable window for cluster administrators to perform the migration, and like how do we get people to actually do the migration eventually? So I think the best way to do that is to deprecate the old format and remove it in a year. So how do we remove that type of functionality from a API?
What about use cases where you're taking these credentials to an external system, like an external CI system, and you want a long-lived token? I don't know how
I think
that where they can't expect that the kubelet's going to maintain their credential and like restart their pod, and there are use cases that these are used for that aren't easily replaced with automatic in-cluster rotation.
long-lived is different than never expiring. So
not in any real practical sense.
I think in a practical sense they are, because if I have an ID token that is like valid for 3 months, I know that I can safely pull a signing key every 6 months, or have a 2-on rotation that a key is only valid for 6 months.
No, I'm not sure that is that useful a difference.
Yeah, I mean, if it's gonna, yeah.
And also, I don't like revisiting my CI setups every 3 or 6 months. Like when you set up a GitHub token that is good as an API token, it doesn't expire.
Part of the mechanism there that's different, like with the GitHub tokens, is they're not stateless sort of signed assertions of identity. It's just a
right. And I'm not saying that this should be stateless either. I think if non-expiring things should be bound to something that is represented as state inside the API, which makes it irrevocable.
I think that makes sense to add as a new concept of like a perma token, even though that's sort of what we have now.
It's exactly what we have now.
Yeah, but the thing we have now is sort of not described that way, and I think the most common use case is the in-cluster case, where we really do want automatic rotation.
Yeah, I think humans are generally really bad at kind of very infrequent things with like big consequences. Like you can imagine, like, so if my workflow is like I get a thing for 6 months and then I go put it in my CI/CD system and I have to set a calendar reminder to remind myself, then like that's definitely like that's just asking for failure. Like that's a really predictable kind of failure mode there, I think.
Okay, so if we do support this, is it okay to keep a separate key ring for long-lived or non-expiring tokens?
It's interesting. If the timeline is long enough, switching what the kubelet generates for point of use to expiring, like if you run a pod and it gets restarted, I guess we can't make assumptions about pod restart being necessarily safe, depending on whether it's replicated, and that gets really tough. I mean, if the lifetime is like a year or 6 months or something, are you expecting people to upgrade their clusters and drain and reload and upgrade their kubelets every few months or every few years? Could we start making reasonable changes from non-expiring to expiring for the point of use ones? API-wise, I think you still have to be able to request non-expiring ones, but if the kubelet at the point of use generation started requesting expiring ones that were really long-lived, and an administrator could crank that down shorter, if they wanted to, or an application could do something in a pod that could indicate, yeah, I can handle rotation, make it really short. I think that's how we move it. So API-wise, it stays non-expiring, but the kubelet and individual pods can start opting into shorter ones.
Okay. Yeah, so I had imagined that like we would want to, when we flip this, we would want to rotate keys every few days. So potentially keep non-expiring tokens around. We can make them individually revocable by embedding UID of a service account, and also UID of like, should we do like a UID of an empty secret?
I mean, yeah, I mean, a secret object that indicates that there is a token and it could keep the same type. Like that's going to map well to people managing existing service account tokens. Like this is here. If you delete it, it revokes it. I think that makes sense.
So if part of it, apologies if I'm not understanding everything here, but if part of the problem here is we want to rotate the root signing key for service account tokens, but we have these tokens that live forever. They live in some third system, and we don't necessarily have the ability to automatically rotate. Why do those tokens need to be, and it's we're sort of embedding state, and we're saying every time we validate one of those tokens, we're checking it against a UID and a secret. Mm-hmm. Why do we bother with the root key, right? Why not just store a verifier in that secret for that?
Because
token?
We don't want a namespace user to be able to just create a thing in a secret and have it become a valid API credential. Like the signing, the fact that it's a valid signed blob means that something outside the namespace user's control generated this.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I would like to keep these in separate planes of existence. Separate the key rings, separate the generation flows for these, and we can see how it evolves. But it would be, I think, nice to wean ourselves off of and our users off of the non-expiring tokens.
Okay, you're already going to have new options to the API server for the signing keys, because the option you have today is something people can give public keys to. So if you want to enable this as an API, you have to tell it, you have to now tell the API server, here's the signing key to use. And so if you have one for expiring and one for non-expiring, that's interesting, but could let you do that.
I could put legacy in front of those command line options.
Just make people feel bad about themselves.
Yeah.
So another question. So the problem where I understand now, you don't want to have creating a secret in a namespace to sort of magically generate an identity in that namespace. But what if, but the fact that there's a secret in a namespace with a UID, and that's the thing we're checking against, also feels like an implementation artifact. Do we also solve this problem if instead of having that secret with a UID live in a namespace, we keep that bit of state in a cluster scoped object somehow?
I would be very happy to see tokens not live by default as secrets. The original.
If it's cluster scoped, then that means that the namespace user can't revoke it. Again, the management of a service account and its artifacts belong to the namespace.
Yeah, I would still have a separate resource though. I mean, your very first implementation didn't put it in a secret.
So the user in the namespace can manage this logical service account, but do they need to manage the sort of the verifier for the token?
They had access. They need to be able to delete it, but not having it in a secret, having it as a separate resource sounds great to me. In comparison.
Yeah, there are pros and cons. Given that there's nothing actually confidential in the record, it's just a sort of marker so that you can see that it exists and you can revoke it, but it doesn't actually contain anything confidential. That's it wouldn't bother me for it to be a non-secret. A new resource.
But what's our goal? Is our goal to maintain the old workflow until we can get people to move off of it. It's like the keys, to be clear, the ID token is not stored in the secret, but the secret exists to maintain the old revocation flow.
Sounds like there's two things we want to do. One is maintain backwards compatibility for some number of releases. The other is in the future, even once we have this shiny new rotating token system, potentially there's also a use case for non-rotating.
See, that's what I'm not super keen on.
So Mike, even for things with time, with expiration dates, and I know we're running out of time, we can wrap this up. I would still expect it to be bound to something that can be deleted. So generated for use with a pod, and have the pod UID as a claim. And if you delete the pod UID, then you can't use that token against the API. Like whether it's a secret or a pod or something, like I would expect these to be bound to things that can be deleted.
Yeah. So that if I lose it, I can delete it immediately, and I don't have to wait for 3 days for it to expire.
Yeah, and something generated for point of use with a pod, logically binding it to the pod, you would make sense, right? If your pod gets compromised and you want to revoke the credentials, deleting the pod is a logical step. Like
I absolutely agree, but that's different than supporting forever tokens forever.
Maybe.
So like if a kubelet generates a 30-minute token for a pod, I think that we should bind the validity of that pod to the existence of the pod, or the validity of that ID token to the existence of the pod.
Yeah. I think there are enough similarities in how you would manage those things and revoke those things before their expiration, or determine whether it's safe to rotate your keys, that whether it's bound to a pod or a secret, the commonalities are they let you query and determine whether the signing keys are safe to rotate in really similar ways. So having an option to continue with the current flow for like external systems or cases where someone knows they want a non-expiring token, it doesn't really bother me, I guess.
So Jordan, in what case would you want a secret to actually be, let me rephrase that. Why do you ever want service accounts to store their token in a secret? Like, what does that give you? I know you want to be able to, in an object, to delete things. That's fine. I agree with that part. I agree with David on, I never want it in a secret. It's really annoying because now getting access to secrets means you also get access to all.
I don't ever want service account tokens in secrets.
Okay.
I kind of agree with David. Like if there's a different object that makes sense for the tombstone revocation thing, that's fine as well.
But I would only feel good about doing that migration if we want to support forever tokens in perpetuity. That is the case that I would like to transition to a dedicated resource for this. But let's discuss next meeting or on the PR.
Okay. Yep. We're running over. Thanks everyone for your time, and we'll see you in the issues.
Bye.